Hi everybody, it's Sunday and so time for my weekly visit with you. Let me begin by saying how much I've enjoyed reading your research proposals, your proposals for your creative research project. There's going to be a wide range of works covered. Some of you are working on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some of you are working on the Old Testament. Some of you are working on the Odyssey. And then we have at least one person working on Shakespeare's King Lear and one person working on Shanagan's The Pillow Book. So great range of projects and great range of approaches. I'm hoping that really now what you're doing is working towards finding sources. Some of you have been looking at sources. Some of you are still kind of at the beginning stages of searching for scholarly sources. If you need help with that search, please let me know. I'm more than happy to help you find good articles and books on your research topic. So just keep me posted. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the work that we're doing this week. And we have somewhat of a break this week in that we're not reading a work so much as we're preparing to read a work. We're starting our all-too-brief unit on ancient Greek theater. And since I made an assumption, I'm not sure if it's right or wrong, but I'm assuming that most of you have probably already read Sophocles' very famous classical tragedy, Oedipus Rex. And if you have, that's wonderful, right? It will give you some sense of what the ancient Greek theater is all about. We always used to be required reading in high school. Maybe things have changed, or maybe it's been a while since you were in high school. But hopefully you have that background, because the play that we are looking at is a play by one of the four great tragedians of the classical age, right? And Sophocles was one of those, but Euripides, and we're looking at Euripides, the Bacchae. It's an extraordinary work, where Sophocles' Oedipus comes rather early on in that classical age. Euripides' play, the Bacchae, comes late in that age and really is a kind of warning about a forecast of the fall of that classical age. So to prepare for the reading, I've assigned two different kinds of readings. One about the theater space, right, the space of what the Greeks called the theatron, and some also the other, right, about readings in tragedy, the genre in which the Bacchae is composed. Most of you are probably familiar with the basic structure of the ancient Greek theaters, but I still want you to have a close look or relook at this space, and not just as a physical space, but as a space that is also a social space. And when you look at this space, to see it as a space that tells us a great deal about the circulation of power. So you want to ask yourself, where does the chorus, right, and the Greek chorus almost always represents us, right, the kind of just ordinary people in the world. Where does that chorus dance, right? Where do they sing and chant and dance? And where is the boundary between the chorus's space, right, what we call the orchestra, and the space in which the main players appear, right, on the scena or in front of the scena? And I want you to think, too, about the meaning of theatron, right? The Greek word for theater, theatron, means the seeing place. And, of course, on the one hand, right, that's very literal when you imagine these incredibly beautiful ancient theaters built into the sides of hillsides, right? And you imagine that the audience kind of raised up on the hillside and the theater at the bottom. Certainly, one way of thinking about seeing is very, very literal, right? We're seeing what unfolds on that stage and seeing it without any kind of impediment in our way, right? It's an amazing kind of space in which to perform a visual spectacle. But what else is being seen, right? Greek tragedy is always about something being revealed, some essence of the self, something about the human condition. And so that seeing is both literal, right, but it's also a kind of figurative seeing here. think about the conditions of the theater, right? Its exposure to the outside, and think also about the meaning of this theater to the culture in which it evolved. Theater was central, right, to ancient Greek culture, absolutely central to the Greeks of the classical age. And finally, though, as you think about what we know about this theater, think about what we don't know about it. Right? Most of our knowledge about the Greek theater has come from archaeological remains, right? The remains at the theater sites themselves, and also vase paintings which depict theater scenes. But of course, there's much that we cannot know about this theater. And one of the things that we cannot know, right, is really exactly how the performances looked. Right? We don't know how people, what they sounded like. We certainly don't know what the music was like. Very little, tiny little fragments of music have survived, but nothing that would tell us about a whole kind of performance. We do know something about the way the voice might have sounded because people were speaking through masks. Right? The Greek theater was a theater of mask, and so speaking through the mask also changes the quality and the nature of the voice. We know that there was much music and much dancing as well, and the chorus particularly performed those functions. But we can't know exactly what did it look like, right? What was it? What did it appear to be? It must have been incredible, right? It must have been fantastic to watch these choral dances and to hear the chorus chanting. It must have been an immersive experience for the viewer. But it's something we'll have to imagine rather than know for sure. Now, perhaps the more challenging, or what you may find the more challenging and frustrating and confusing part of the week's readings have to do with not so much the theater space itself, but with the genre of tragedy. And this is, of course, because tragedy has a very, very long history. It stretches all the way back to ancient Greece. Maybe earlier than that, but certainly that's the first place we hear about it as a genre. And it isn't something that, like any form, like any genre, right? Genres aren't completely stable things, right? They change and they evolve over time. And so I've given you two different perspectives on tragedy, two very different perspectives. One of them is Aristotle's, right, which is a classic, the kind of classic text from Aristotle's Poetics on the nature of Greek tragedy. And one of them is a much more modern take on tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. And there are many more, right? These simply do not exhaust at all notions and conceptions and theories of tragedy, but they are at least two ways of approaching the tragedy of Euripides that I think will be helpful. So let's start with Aristotle. And it will not surprise you if you've read Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, if you were then to read Aristotle's Poetics, that Aristotle's Poetics is very much based on his reading of Sophocles. And he tells us, or he believes anyway, he puts forth, tragedy then is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. Every tragedy, therefore, must have 6 parts, which parts determine its quality, namely, plot, characters, diction, thought, spectacle, and melody. Okay, well, that's Aristotle. And I would, though, really admonish you not to take Aristotle as the only or the last word on what tragedy is. There are many, many, many theories about this. But Aristotle can give us a helpful way, right, a useful way of moving into a classical play like Euripides the Bacchae. So let's talk about this after this imitation of action. Right? Character has second place in importance. But in a perfect tragedy, right, Aristotle would hold, characters will support the plot. Right? Personal motivations are going to be very intricately, very intimately connected with the cause, the chain of actions that produce ultimately the pity and the fear in the audience. The protagonist of a tragedy is not an ordinary person, right? This idea of the ordinary hero, that has nothing to do with ancient Greek tragedy. The protagonist is somebody who is renowned, right? Somebody prosperous, so that when the protagonist falls, right, when his fortune turns from good to bad, we feel that fall even more intensely. And that fall, right, that change of fortune, is not something, it's not just something that happens, it's not just something random. It comes about as a result, not, right, Aristotle tells us, and this is important, not of vice, right, not because the character is evil, but of something else, some error, some frailty in the character. I can't overstress this point, really, because what generally happens is when you're taught about tragedy in high school, the word that most often gets associated with the tragic hero is hubris. It was the pride, it was that overweening pride of the hero that led to his demise. Well, yes, and well, no. Or when we say that, we needn't kind of impose upon it our own cultural sense of overweening pride. What is meant by that for the ancient Greeks, or the classical Greeks, is something very different. It's not a Christian sense of being too prideful. What it means is that the person, right, the tragic hero, is always somebody who is almost at the edge between being human and being God, right? Almost between being a mortal and being an immortal. And it's that human beings, right, that the tragic character is someone who pushes that boundary between the human, separating the human from the immortal, the mortal from the immortal, to its absolute limit. And it's at that point, when it's at the absolute limits, that the gods say no, right, and push him, usually always him, or sometimes her, not always him, push him or her back to a recognition, an acknowledgement of being human. Right, so in this way, right, Greek tragedy is about the human condition. And to understand what the human condition is, we have to go to its outer reaches, right, almost that point where the human becomes the inhuman, right, or the immortal, the divine, and then doesn't, right, isn't able to, and is pressed back into what the human condition is. And that is what the human condition is, right? It is, at its best, it's a kind of striving towards something more, something greater, right? And that's what happens to the Greek hero or the Greek heroine. That is what hubris is, right? Not just this kind of Christian sense of being too prideful. Okay, so a little bit more then about thought, right? Thought comes third in Aristotle's hierarchy, or his list of elements in a tragedy. And it's important, right? He doesn't say a whole lot about what he means by thought, but probably what he means are the themes of the plays, right? So character is important, right? But also, what is this play about? What are the themes of the play? There's also, though, right, fourth, we have diction. And diction, right, means is word choice, and the expression, right, of meaning in words, which are appropriate to the plot and to the characters, and to the tragedy itself. And it's very important, right, when we think of the Greek plays, to remember that diction, word choice, we're not thinking about an ordinary language, ordinary everyday language. These plays are written in verse, right? So people are speaking poetry, right, or chanting poetry, or singing poetry. It's a high language, a very high diction, not ordinary at all. And that may be one of the things that makes it difficult for us to read tragedy today. We're not used to that, hearing poetry spoken that way. But try to get past it, because it's also, language can be beautiful. Song, right, or the musical elements are also important to tragedy. And Aristotle argues, and I think this is really an important note to take when we're approaching the Bacchae, that the chorus should be fully integrated into the play, and that the choral odes, right, the passages that the chorus speaks or sings should not simply be mere interludes, right, but be very important to the unity of the plot. And I say this, or I make this point strongly, because I think it's tempting at times. You're reading a difficult work and you get to the chorus again, you think, oh, I'll just skim the choral parts. Don't skim what the chorus has to say. Right? What the chorus says is really, really important, and what the chorus says reflects how a Greek audience would have understood the actions in the play. So it gives us a lot of important clues as to how the ideas in the play are received by the people watching them. And finally, he talks about spectacle. But for Aristotle, right, spectacle, what you see right on the stage, that too, that's important, but it shouldn't be spectacle for spectacle's sake, right? The spectacle has to also be extremely related, right, to the plot. And he argues, and I think I might even agree with him here, right, that superior poets, superior tragedians, use spectacle sparingly. Right? They don't use it to unduly influence us. They don't rely on it too heavily, but they do to create a sense for us of the important themes in the play. Okay, finally, let's talk a little bit about catharsis, right? What Aristotle means by catharsis, which is, I think, probably a word that you've heard many times before. It's an Aristotelian term, and it means, right, literally a purging. But what it means is, and it's a kind of a medical metaphor, actually, but it means that tragedy arouses in the people who are watching it two emotions: pity and fear, right? Pity for the person, the tragic hero, but fear for ourselves. Fear for ourselves that this fate, we too, right, could have a fate like this. And catharsis is the purging, not so much, I think, as some people say, purging away of these emotions, but a purging into these emotions. Right? What tragedy does is not to kind of level out our feelings about things, right, but make us, immerse us in pity and immerse us in fear before we come back to a kind of balanced sense of proportion between a balanced sort of more ordinary life. Okay. So that's Aristotle in a nutshell. And obviously, if you were to read Aristotle's Poetics, you would see that there was much more to it than that. But these, I think, are some of the important things that we can bring to a reading of the Bacchae. But we don't want to rest with Aristotle's definition alone, because tragedy is a living form, an evolving form, and it is also certainly much more than a form. Right? Tragedy isn't a template that we can just sort of put down and then fill in the blanks here. So I also wanted to tell you a little bit about another very influential thinker on tragedy, and that is Friedrich Nietzsche, right? Obviously a modern thinker about tragedy. And Nietzsche wrote a book rather early on in his career called The Birth of Tragedy, which was explicitly concerned with Greek drama, Greek tragic drama. And he saw two trends emerging in Greek theater and Greek art as a whole, and he calls those trends in the Greek theater of the classical or the Golden Age Dionysian and Apollonian. So the Dionysian trend, right, is the trend that Nietzsche associates with the god Dionysus. And if you do read the lectures here, you'll see why this is so important, right? Why Dionysus is such an extremely important god when we think about tragedy and the history of tragedy. So Nietzsche associates, right, this Dionysian trend with the cult of Dionysus, and Dionysus, right, who is the god of grapes, the god of wine, and the god of ecstasy in general. The Romans called him Bacchus. Right, the Greeks called him Dionysus, but all of the the ancient Greek theater, right, evolved from Dionysian rituals, pretty wild rituals that I describe more fully in the notes. And so Nietzsche picks up on these festivals, these wild sort of festivals, and thinks about that as one trend in the Greek theater towards the ecstatic. And then there's the other trend in the Greek theater, which is Apollonian. And Apollonian comes from Apollo, right, the god of light and reason. And he says that these things are always in kind of contest with one another. The Dionysian, bacchanalia, right, that sense of the ecstatic, experience of the ecstatic, and then the Apollonian, right, this need for order and reason. And that there's a tension between these two trends, right? These two trends in thinking, ways of thinking that get played out in the Greek theater, and we will certainly see that happening in Euripides. So keep in mind, right, those two forces, right, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And then I want you to know another insight that Nietzsche has into tragedy, or a claim that he makes about it. And Nietzsche says that two things are true of life, right? And one of them is that life is terrible and tragic. Right? That if we were really if we're going to analyze life and what happens to us in life, that we will see, right, that life is in fact terrible and tragic. But, he says, and this is where it really gets interesting, the tragic hero will realize this, will realize that life is tragic and terrible, and say yes to it. Immerse himself or herself in the terror, in the tragedy, and in that sense, have an ecstatic experience. Right? So when you think about tragedy, it's not just misery. Right? Tragedy is something more than that. For Nietzsche, right, the tragic hero understands what life is, immerses himself or herself in that horror, and says yes to it, and then reaches, because of that assent, right, reaches a kind of ecstatic sense. It's not pessimistic. Right? It's not about being pessimistic or being depressed. Right? No. Right? It is about being accepting a condition of life, and nonetheless turning into it with a kind of ecstatic, almost joy. So this Dionysian sense again, right? This Dionysian immersion into the very stream of life, into this breaking of barriers, breaking of restraints, and this affirmation and embrace of existence in all of its darkness. That is what tragedy is, right? Or that's the essence of tragedy for Nietzsche. But then, of course, right, we come back in the resolution of tragedy to the Apollonian, to light, to measure, to restraint, and to this principle of what we might call individuation, right? Not this fusion into the ecstatic and emerging with everything, but also but coming back to the individual. I know that these are actually extremely hard concepts. They're concepts people think about their whole lives, but I think they're really fascinating ones, and ones you should be armed with as you begin your reading of Euripides the Bacchae. All right. I look forward to your responses this week. And I also look forward to the development of your research projects. And I just want to say that I know some of you may be struggling a little bit with that. And if you are struggling with that, I'd like to meet with you. We can always meet virtually, right, of course. But this week I will be on campus for a couple of days, and I would very much like to see you if you would like to see me. So on the 14th, October 14th, I will be on campus and able to see you sometime between 2:30 and 4:30 in the afternoon. And I will be back the next day on the 15th in the morning between 9:30 and noon. And then again in the afternoon between about 1 and 3 or 1 and 4 if you need me to stay longer. So if there's something you'd like to discuss with me, please let me know ahead of time so we can set things up. I don't mind talking to people individually, and I don't mind talking to people in groups. If there are a lot of people who want to see me, I will probably limit our time a little bit to about 15 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes. So it would be very, very helpful if if you want to see me, that before you do that, you tell me how I can best help you so I can prepare for that meeting a little bit ahead of time. Anyway, I'm looking forward to hopefully meeting a few of you in person. Obviously, this is not a requirement, and also I'm happy to meet you virtually as well. Take care, and I'll see you soon.